The U.S. intelligence community is close to halfway through its 90-day investigation into the origins of COVID-19. It's looking into whether the virus emerged naturally through human contact with an infected animal or leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. Stanford professor David Relman is advising the government on the science behind the pandemic. He told CBS News the Wuhan lab housed a vast library of bat viruses, including specimens from caves that are the closest known relative to the COVID-19 virus.
The lab leak hypotheses are absolutely legitimate. They are plausible. They weren't just studying these viruses. They were actually collecting samples from nature in the largest number with the greatest diversity of almost any place on the planet.
And CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins me now to explain what we're learning. Hi there, Catherine. Thank you for being here. So what are the two competing theories of how COVID-19 first reached humans?
Well, Caitlin, the first theory is called zoonotic. That's a very scientific term, but what it means is that the virus jumped to humans through an infected animal. So think about things like the wet market in Wuhan. We heard about that in the earliest days of the pandemic, and then also the wildlife trade. The second theory, the lab leak theory, is based on the premise that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were handling these highly contagious viruses, but there was some kind of spill or accidental exposure so that the researcher was infected and then walked out of the lab with the virus. One of the things we learned in the course of our investigation here at CBS News from former State Department officials is that the research at the Wuhan lab was done at a bio-level safety 2. And we were told that's really the equivalent of a dentist's office or a doctor's office when you have a procedure. What you see here, these kind of bubble suits, that's a bio-level safety 4, and that was not the level at which the scientists were handling many of these viruses. So that video, I think, in many respects, has been very misleading over the course of the last year as to the type of safety protocols that were in place when they were handling these bat viruses.
And Catherine, earlier this year, the State Department released a fact sheet saying that they believed a handful of researchers at the Wuhan lab were sick with COVID-19-like symptoms in the fall of 2019. That's before the Chinese government went public with the virus. So former senior State Department official David Feith, who helped craft that fact sheet, told you that the information was solid and credible. Take a listen.
The U.S. government's information on this fact, on the lab workers being ill, was completely high confidence.
So what else did you learn about the intelligence here?
Well, Caitlin, one of the most striking things we learned from former government officials is that there was very significant information about the lab's activities in Wuhan in the late fall of 2019 before the Chinese government acknowledged the virus, and this information was buried in U.S. government databases. And in some cases, it took nearly a year to reach the desks of researchers here in Washington. This is important because it told us a lot more about the activities in the months leading up to the pandemic. And the second thing that we learned is that one of the government's top labs in this country, Lawrence Livermore, did a classified report that examined the likely origins of the virus behind COVID-19. And in May of 2020, the Lawrence Livermore labs found that it was plausible that it may have leaked from one of the laboratories. Yet that report did not reach the desks of these investigators until October and November of 2020, so about a 5-month gap. And it's very hard to understand how in the midst of this pandemic, that kind of information didn't really go up to the top priority list, but seemed buried. And I asked, do you think there was some kind of malign intent? And I didn't hear that from people. What I heard is they felt the government was kind of buried in big data. They've got all of this information they're hoovering up, but it's not possible to process it in a timely fashion. And that may have been one of the things that happened here in the earliest days of the pandemic.
Yeah, because back in 2020, in February of 2020, the lab leak theory was being called a conspiracy by scientists. What's changed since then?
Well, the simple answer is that we just know more today than we did in February of 2020, when in fact very little was known about the virus. CBS News has obtained these 2018 State Department diplomatic cables. A team from the U.S. government went into the lab in Wuhan, and what they found is that there were some significant deficits when it came to technicians handling these viruses. You can see the lab shortage of trained staff. So that opened up the possibility that there could be accidents in the lab. What we also know is that when investigators with the WHO went to Wuhan earlier this year, they had access blocked to a lot of data. And that was the finding of the WHO president, saying we need to have more access. And I think finally, there's no evidence of this zoonotic link. There's no evidence of the animal that would have been that intermediate bridge between the virus and humans. And this is in spite of the fact that the Chinese government has tested over 80,000 samples, wildlife, livestock, poultry, looking for this animal that may be the bridge. So in some respects, it's a circumstantial case, but what's equally important is the lack of evidence which has come to support this zoonotic or animal link.
So many questions. I mean, and the Biden administration has been playing down the prospect that we'll actually get a conclusive answer from this investigation. Can you tell us what to expect, what we might be expecting to know at the end of this 90-day review?
Well, based on my reporting here at CBS News, what the intelligence community is doing is it's going back through its holdings as one element of the review to find all of those pieces of this very complex puzzle, like the sick lab workers in the fall of 2019, and trying to put that mosaic together to get a better sense of the timeline and the activities before the pandemic. What I've heard universally from experts as well as former government officials is that they don't expect to have a definitive answer, but they expect to have a more focused view of the origin of this virus and some additional questions for the Chinese Communist Party. But the bottom line for all of us is that if we have a better sense of the origins, it will mean that we're better prepared for the next pandemic. So whether it's restricting wildlife trade, if that ultimately is the source, which we've seen in the past, or whether it was a lab accident and improving the safety protocols within labs. Because unfortunately, what everyone understands is that there will be a next time.
Exactly, and why these questions and answers are so critical for us to get to the bottom of. Catherine Herridge, thank you as always for your investigation, your reporting, and for being with us.